My husband cheated with his ex in my own house, then left me with divorce papers and lies. I found secret photos proving she'd been staying for months, kicked her out, and he ran back to her, so I gathered evidence, moved away, and she never expected what happened next. If this story pulled you in, please subscribe to Velvet Stories so you don't miss the next one. It was pouring rain when she showed up at 9:00 p.m., mascara running down her face, claiming her apartment had flooded and she had nowhere else to go. My husband, Garrett, looked at me with those puppy dog eyes that always worked. "She's been through enough," he said. "It's just one night, I wanted to say no." Every instinct screamed at me to shut that door, but I was raised to be kind, to help people in need, to be the bigger person. So I smiled and stepped aside. Natalie walked in like she owned the place, trailing muddy footprints across the hardwood floors I just refinished. She apologized profusely, but her eyes were already scanning our home. The photos on the mantel, the wedding portrait above the couch, the way Garrett's hand rested on my lower back. I made up the guest room while she showered. When I went to get fresh towels, I found her going through my medicine cabinet. "Just looking for aspirin," she said sweetly. Terrible headache from all the stress. That first night stretched into a weekend, then a week. Her apartment repairs kept getting delayed. The contractor needed more time. The insurance wasn't processing her claim. She was so sorry to impose, but where else could she go? Garrett kept making excuses for her. She helped him through his divorce. He reminded me, "We owe her this much." I bit my tongue and played the gracious hostess while resentment built inside me. By week 2, I noticed small changes. My favorite coffee mug kept ending up in her room. She'd wear my cardigan, claiming she thought it was from the guest closet. She started cooking Garrett's favorite meals, the ones he'd mentioned missing. "Remember when I used to make this for you?" she'd say, touching his arm. He'd laugh and reminisce while I stood there feeling like a stranger in my own kitchen. The worst part was how subtle it all was, nothing I could point to without sounding paranoid. Then came the photos. I was scrolling through our shared cloud storage when I found them. Dozens of pictures of Natalie in our house, posing in our bedroom, wearing my jewelry, sitting in my spot on the couch with her head on Garrett's shoulder, and they weren't recent. The timestamps showed they'd been taken over months, long before that rainy night, long before her supposed apartment flood. My hands shook as I scrolled through image after image. I confronted Garrett that evening after Natalie conveniently left to run errands. He went pale when I showed him my phone. His explanation came out in a jumbled rush. She'd been having a hard time financially. He'd let her stay here occasionally when I was working night shifts at the hospital. It was innocent. They were just friends. She needed help and he couldn't turn his back on someone who'd supported him. "But the photos," I said. "Why didn't you tell me? He couldn't meet my eyes. You would have said no." The betrayal cut deeper than any affair. He'd been sneaking his ex-wife into our home for months, letting her play house and the life we'd built together, making me the villain for wanting boundaries while painting her as the victim who needed saving. When Natalie returned, I was waiting with her suitcase packed. "Time to leave," I said calmly. She looked at Garrett, waiting for him to defend her. He stared at the floor. She tried to argue, to explain, to cry. I stood firm until she finally grabbed her bag and walked out. That should have been the end. But the next morning, I woke up to find Garrett gone, his closet empty, his toiletries cleared from the bathroom. On the kitchen counter sat divorce papers with a note in his handwriting. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. Natalie needs me, and I've realized I never stopped loving her. You deserve someone who chooses you first. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the house." I stood there in my empty kitchen, holding the note, surrounded by the life I thought we'd built together. The coffee maker gurgled, filling 2 cups out of habit, one for me, one for a husband who was already gone. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo. Natalie and Garrett smiling in what looked like a hotel room. The caption read, "Thanks for the lovely stay. Some things are worth waiting for." The first person I called was my best friend, Michaela. She drove over immediately, finding me still standing in the kitchen, still holding that note. The coffee had gone cold. She took one look at my face and pulled me into her arms. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The shock was too fresh, too complete. "How long?" she asked quietly. I showed her the photos, the timestamps. The months of deception stretched out in digital evidence. Her face went pale, then red with fury. "That absolute piece of garbage. We spent that day documenting everything. Every photo, every timestamp, every text message I could find." Michaela was a paralegal, and she knew what I'd need. "Trust me," she said, taking screenshots of Natalie's social media where she'd been posting about her apartment the whole time. No flooding, no emergency, just carefully staged photos designed to look like she was struggling. Her apartment had been fine all along. The entire story was fabricated, a carefully constructed lie to manipulate Garrett's guilt and my compassion. The divorce moved quickly once my lawyer saw the evidence. Garrett had walked out, abandoned the marital home, and his affair was documented in his own cloud storage. His lawyer tried to argue he deserved half of everything. Mine pointed out that he'd been conducting an affair in my house while I worked night shifts at the hospital. The house I'd purchased before we married with my inheritance from my grandmother. The judge was not sympathetic, but the real nightmare started when Natalie began her campaign. She posted on social media about how I'd thrown a woman in need out on the street, how Garrett had finally escaped an emotionally abusive marriage, how she and Garrett were soulmates torn apart by my jealousy and control. Her posts painted me as a villain while she played the long-suffering other woman who'd waited patiently for true love to prevail. The comments were vicious. People I'd never met called me names, said I deserved to be alone, that Garrett was brave for leaving. My co-workers at the hospital started treating me differently. Some had seen the posts. Others had heard rumors. The whispers followed me through the corridors. I'd been working there for 6 years, building my reputation as a reliable nurse, someone who showed up and did the work. Now I was the bitter ex-wife who couldn't let go. When I tried to defend myself, I sounded exactly like Natalie had described: jealous, controlling, unable to accept that my marriage had failed. My sister called me one evening, her voice tight with concern. "Mom saw the posts," she said. "She's worried about you." I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised me. "Tell Mom I'm fine. I'm the one who got betrayed, remember?" But even as I said it, I could feel the doubt creeping in. Maybe I had been too rigid about boundaries. Maybe I should have been more understanding about Garrett's friendship with his ex. Maybe I was the problem. That's what gaslighting does. It makes you question your own reality, even when you're holding the evidence in your hands. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls from anyone except Michaela and my sister. I worked my shifts at the hospital, came home, and sat in the dark living room of a house that felt too big and too empty. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday. I signed the papers in my lawyer's office while Garrett signed them remotely. He got some money from the sale of his car and the furniture he brought into the marriage. I kept the house, my car, and my sanity, though some days that last one felt debatable. Then the bills started arriving. Credit cards I'd never opened. Store accounts in my name with thousands charged. Someone had stolen my identity and gone on a shopping spree. The fraud department asked if I had any idea who might have access to my personal information. I thought about Natalie going through my medicine cabinet that first night, going through my drawers while I was at work. I had no proof, but I knew. The police said without evidence there was nothing they could do. The credit card companies launched investigations that went nowhere. I spent months fighting charges, freezing my credit, changing every password and security question. The financial damage was manageable. The violation of it made me feel sick. She'd been in my home touching my things, stealing my information while playing the victim who needed help. Michaela wanted me to confront them, to post my own story with the evidence, to fight back against the narrative Natalie had constructed. But I was tired. So tired of fighting, of defending myself, of trying to make people believe the truth when the lie was so much more compelling. The jilted wife versus the devoted ex who'd waited years for her chance at happiness. It was a story people wanted to believe. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, threw myself into work with a dedication that worried my supervisor. She called me into her office one afternoon and closed the door. "You're burning out," she said gently. "I can see it happening. Take some time off, go somewhere, do something that has nothing to do with this hospital or this city." I thanked her and said I'd think about it, but where would I go? What was I running from? The truth was everywhere I looked. My friend from nursing school, Patricia, reached out. She'd moved to Portland and was working at a research hospital. "They're hiring," she said. "Fresh start, new city. No one here knows your story." The offer was tempting, a chance to disappear, to become someone new, to leave behind the wreckage of my marriage and Natalie's lies. But running away felt like admitting defeat, like letting them win. That's when my grandmother's lawyer called. My grandmother, who died 4 years earlier and left me the house. There was a trust I didn't know about, a substantial amount of money she'd set aside specifically for emergencies, for when life knocked me down and I needed help getting back up. The lawyer explained she'd left a letter with the trust documents. He read it to me over the phone, my grandmother's words reaching across death to remind me who I was. You are not what they say you are. You are what you do when no one is watching. You are the kindness you showed when it cost you something. You are the strength you found when everything fell apart. Don't let small people make you smaller. I cried for the first time since finding Garrett gone. Sat in my empty house and sobbed until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen. Grieved for my marriage, for my trust, for the naive belief that being kind meant people would be kind in return. When the tears stopped, I felt lighter, clearer, ready. I hired a private investigator not to harass Natalie and Garrett, but to document the truth. He found the credit card statements from the stolen identity, traced them back to purchases made in stores near where Natalie worked, found security footage of her using cards in my name, her face clear in the camera. Found records showing she'd never had an apartment flood, that she'd actually been evicted from her previous place for non-payment and had been living in her car when she showed up at my door. The investigator also found something else. Natalie had done this before. Her first husband had left his second wife for her under eerily similar circumstances. That marriage lasted 18 months before she moved on. Her second husband had a nearly identical story. She had a pattern of targeting recently divorced men, playing the supportive ex-wife, manipulating her way into their new relationships, then destroying them from the inside. Garrett was number 4. I gave the report to my lawyer not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted documentation. The truth matters even when people don't want to hear it. She advised me to keep it safe, to have it ready if Natalie escalated. For now, the best thing I could do was move forward. Let them implode on their own, because according to the investigator's timeline, Natalie's previous marriages had all followed the same pattern. The excitement phase lasted 6 to 8 months. Then came the control phase. Then came the destruction. I took Patricia up on her offer, put the house up for rent, packed what I needed, and moved to Portland. Started fresh at the research hospital where no one knew me as the bitter ex-wife. Just as a competent nurse who showed up on time and did good work. I found an apartment with a view of the mountains. Adopted a cat from the local shelter, a scraggly orange tabby who'd been abandoned by his previous owners. We were 2 castaways building a new life together. For months, I didn't hear anything about Garrett or Natalie. I'd blocked them on social media, deleted their numbers, removed myself from their story entirely. Then Michaela called with an update. The marriage lasted 5 months. Natalie had already moved on to someone new, leaving Garrett with debt, a destroyed credit score, and a reputation in tatters. His family had cut him off after learning the truth. His job had let him go after his absences, and declining performance became too much to overlook. He was living in a basement apartment and working retail. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to take satisfaction in his downfall, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the time we'd wasted. Sad that he'd chosen such a destructive path. Sad that Natalie was out there doing the same thing to someone else. Michaela said he'd reached out to her asking if I'd be willing to talk. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to ask for forgiveness. I told her, no, some things are too broken to fix. My new life in Portland was quieter. I made friends slowly, carefully, keeping people at a comfortable distance. Started seeing a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma. She helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just a divorce. It was systematic manipulation by someone skilled at emotional warfare. That Garrett had been a victim, too, in his own way. That recognizing his weakness didn't excuse his choices, but did explain them. I met Cameron at a coffee shop near the hospital. He was a physical therapist who worked with trauma patients, teaching them to trust their bodies again. We talked for hours about the work we did, the lives we touched, the small victories that made the hard days worthwhile. He asked me to dinner. I said yes, then immediately panicked and nearly canceled, but Michaela talked me down. Not everyone is Natalie, she reminded me. Not every man is Garrett. You deserve good things. The first date turned into a second, then a third. Cameron was patient with my hesitations, my need to take things slowly, my occasional spirals of doubt. He shared his own story of betrayal. A former fiancé who'd emptied their joint account and disappeared days before the wedding. We were two people learning to trust again, taking careful steps towards something new. 6 months into dating, Cameron met my cat. The cat, who hated everyone and hissed at strangers, immediately curled up in Cameron's lap and started purring. That's when I knew this might actually work. Animals know things we can't always see. My sister visited for Christmas. We cooked dinner together in my small Portland kitchen while the cat supervised from his perch on top of the refrigerator. She told me I looked different, lighter, like I'd finally put down something heavy I'd been carrying. She was right. The anger had faded into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that some people come into your life to teach you what you don't want, what you won't accept, where your boundaries are. Then on a random Tuesday in February, I got a message request on social media from Garrett. I stared at it for a long time before deciding to read it. He'd written several paragraphs, an apology, an explanation, a confession of how completely he'd been manipulated, how he'd lost everything, how he finally understood what he'd destroyed. He didn't ask me to forgive him, just said he wanted me to know that I'd been right about everything and he was sorry for not seeing it sooner. I showed Cameron the message. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I thought about it for a long time, about the person I'd been when I let Natalie into my house. About the person I'd become in the aftermath. About the boundaries I'd learned to set and maintain. I typed a short response. "I appreciate the apology. I hope you find peace." Then I blocked him and deleted the message. Some chapters need to close completely. No epilogue, no last words, just the quiet satisfaction of moving forward without looking back. My therapist asked me if I felt closure. I thought about it. Closure implied an ending, a neat bow tied around a painful experience, but that's not how trauma works. It doesn't end. It transforms. It becomes part of your story, part of what shaped you, but it doesn't define you. I was more careful now, more guarded, but I was also stronger, more certain of what I deserved, less willing to compromise on the things that mattered. Work at the research hospital was challenging in the best way. I was part of a team developing new protocols for post-surgical recovery. My experience as a bedside nurse combined with my attention to detail made me valuable to the research team. They promoted me to a coordinator position, managing studies and working directly with patients. The work was meaningful. It reminded me why I'd become a nurse in the first place. Cameron and I moved in together after a year of dating. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Learning to share space again, to compromise on the small things like thermostat settings and what constitutes an acceptable level of cleanliness. He was patient with my need to maintain separate bank accounts, my reluctance to put his name on the lease. My habit of planning exit strategies even in stable situations. Trauma teaches you to always have a backup plan. Then one evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Natalie. My blood went cold. Before I could hang up, she started talking fast. "I know you have no reason to listen to me. I know what I did, but I need to tell you something, and then I'll never contact you again." Every instinct told me to hang up, but curiosity won. I put the phone on speaker so Cameron could hear. Natalie's voice was different, smaller, without the performative sweetness she'd used when playing the victim. She'd been arrested for identity theft, multiple victims across several states. The prosecutor was building a case and my name had come up. They'd found the evidence from my private investigator in the discovery process. She was facing serious prison time, but that's not why I'm calling. She continued, "I'm calling because you need to know Garrett had nothing to do with the identity theft." That was all me. He didn't know. He's not smart enough to pull that off, and he's not cruel enough to do it intentionally. She laughed, bitter and harsh. He was just weak, the easiest target I'd ever found. I made him believe I was his savior when really I was destroying him, just like I destroyed you. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm, detached. "Because my lawyer says showing remorse might help with sentencing," she said bluntly. "And because my therapist says I need to take accountability, though honestly, I think she's full of it." She paused. "For what it's worth, you were the only one who saw through me from the start. That's why I had to work so hard to turn Garrett against you. You were the only real threat." I thanked her for calling and hung up. Sat in silence with Cameron, processing what I just heard. Part of me felt vindicated. The truth was finally coming out, but mostly I felt tired. Tired of being connected to this story, tired of Natalie's presence in my life, even as a distant memory. When the prosecutor's office called later that week asking if I'd testify, I said no. I'd given them everything they needed in the investigator's report. I didn't need to face her in court to know I'd survived her. Spring came to Portland with cherry blossoms and rain. Cameron proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the city. It was simple. No grand gesture, just him asking if I wanted to build a life together, knowing full well how complicated that was for me. I said yes because he'd earned my trust. Because he'd proven through consistent actions that he was safe. Because I'd learned that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day to show up, to be honest, to do the work. We had a small wedding in my sister's backyard. Michaela was my maid of honor. My cat, now old and gray, supervised from a sunny spot on the patio. I didn't invite any family beyond my sister and my parents. Kept the guest list small and the ceremony shorter. This wasn't about impressing anyone or proving anything. It was about making a promise to someone who'd earned the right to hear it. During the vows, I thought about the night I'd let Natalie into my house. How that single act of misplaced kindness had destroyed my old life completely. But standing there with Cameron, surrounded by people who actually knew me and chose to be there, I realized something. Sometimes things need to be destroyed before they can be rebuilt properly. The life I had with Garrett had been built on shallow ground, pretty on the surface, but unstable underneath. This new life was different, tested by fire, built on bedrock. Natalie was sentenced to 4 years in prison. I heard about it through Michaela, who still followed the case out of morbid curiosity. Garrett didn't attend the sentencing. According to mutual acquaintances, he'd moved back to his hometown, living with his parents, working on rebuilding his credit and his life. I hoped he learned something from the disaster. I hoped he'd developed better judgment. Mostly, I hoped our paths never crossed again. My career continued to grow. I published research papers on patient recovery protocols, presented at conferences, became known in my field as someone who bridged the gap between clinical care and academic research. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. It reminded me that I had value beyond my relationships, that I could build something meaningful entirely on my own merit. Cameron and I bought a house together, a real commitment that still made my stomach flip with anxiety even as I signed the mortgage papers. But we'd done the work, the therapy, the honest conversations about money and expectations, and what happens if things fall apart. We had a prenup, clear boundaries, separate accounts alongside the joint one. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was real, it was safe, it was ours. Sometimes I still thought about that rainy night, about the moment I stepped aside and let Natalie walk into my home, about all the warning signs I'd ignored because I'd been taught to be accommodating. To give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe the best in others even when the evidence suggested otherwise. I'd learned to balance those instincts with harder-won wisdom, to be kind without being naive, to help without sacrificing my own well-being, to recognize that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say no. My grandmother's trust fund was still there, carefully invested, growing steadily. I'd used some to pay for the private investigator and legal fees. The rest sat untouched, a safety net that gave me the freedom to take risks in my career, to walk away from situations that didn't serve me, to know I'd always have options. Financial independence was its own form of freedom. On our first anniversary, Cameron planned a surprise trip to the coast. We stayed in a small cabin overlooking the ocean, spent days hiking, and nights talking about the future. Children, maybe, though I was hesitant, a bigger house eventually, though we were happy where we were. The conversations were easy, honest, free from the performance that had defined my marriage to Garrett. This was what partnership looked like when built on actual trust instead of wishful thinking. I got a message from my sister. Garrett had gotten engaged to someone new, someone who reportedly had no idea about his history. My first instinct was to warn her to send an anonymous message detailing everything that had happened. But Michaela talked me down. You can't save everyone. She reminded me, you can't control what Garrett does or who he hurts. You can only control your own choices, and getting involved in his life again is a choice that won't serve you. She was right. I deleted the message and went back to my own life, to my work, to my husband, to the cat who'd finally accepted that Cameron was a permanent fixture. To the garden I was planting in our backyard, to the future I was building, one careful decision at a time. Years passed. I heard through the grapevine that Garrett's engagement had ended badly, that he'd repeated the same patterns with someone new, that he was still struggling with debt and instability. I felt a distant pang of sympathy, but no desire to reach out. Some people learned from their mistakes, others just keep making new versions of the same ones. I couldn't fix him. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. Natalie got out of prison after serving her full sentence. I only knew because the Victims Advocate Office sent me a notification. She was required to maintain no contact with any of her victims. Violation would send her back to prison immediately. I filed the notice away and tried not to think about her out in the world, potentially starting the cycle again with someone new. I'd done what I could. The rest wasn't my responsibility. Cameron and I eventually did have a child, a daughter with his eyes and my stubborn determination. Holding her in the hospital, I thought about all the ways life had fallen apart and come back together. About the person I'd been when I let Natalie into my house, and the person I'd become in the aftermath. About the lessons I wanted to teach this tiny human about boundaries and trust, and the difference between kindness and self-sacrifice. She would grow up in a stable home with parents who'd done the work to heal their traumas before bringing her into the world. She would see healthy conflict resolution and honest communication. She would learn that love isn't about grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. It's about showing up consistently, being honest even when it's hard, choosing your partner every day not because you have to, but because you want to. The house in my old city eventually sold. The renters had been perfect, but they wanted to buy their own place. I flew back to handle the closing. My first time in the city since leaving. Michaela met me for dinner. We caught up on years of life, lived in different states. She'd gotten married to someone she met at work. They were expecting twins. Life had been kind to both of us after all the chaos. We drove past my old neighborhood out of curiosity. The house looked different. The new owners had painted it a soft gray. Added flower boxes to the windows made it their own. I felt nothing looking at it. No attachment, no nostalgia. It was just a building where I used to live. The emotional weight I'd carried had finally dissolved. That night in my hotel room, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. Dear past self, it started. I'm writing to tell you that you're going to be okay. Better than okay, actually. You're going to lose everything you thought mattered and discover what actually does. You're going to learn the difference between being kind and being a doormat. You're going to find strength you didn't know you had. You're going to rebuild, and the life you build will be so much better than the one you lost. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal, a reminder of how far I'd come. Flying back to Portland felt like returning home in a way that nowhere else ever had. Cameron picked me up from the airport with our daughter strapped to his chest in a carrier. She'd grown so much in just the few days I'd been gone. He kissed me and took my bag and told me about the chaos at home while I was away. It was mundane and perfect, and exactly what I'd been fighting for all along. We stopped for groceries on the way home. I pushed the cart while Cameron consulted the list I'd made before leaving. Our daughter gurgled contentedly in the carrier. Other shoppers smiled at us. This normal little family doing normal weekend things. No one knew our history, the trials we'd survived, the work we'd done to get here. We were just another couple in the produce section, debating whether to buy organic strawberries. That night, tucking our daughter into her crib, I thought about the text message from Natalie all those years ago. Thanks for the lovely stay. Some things are worth waiting for. She'd meant it as a taunt, a victory lap over the ruins of my marriage. But standing there in my daughter's nursery in the house Cameron and I had chosen together, I realized she'd been right. Some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding from the ground up when everything falls apart. The life I had now wasn't the one I'd planned. It was better, more authentic, built on foundation that could weather storms because it had already survived one. I'd learned that kindness without boundaries is just self-destruction wearing a halo. That trust needs to be earned through consistent action, not demanded through emotional manipulation. That the only person responsible for your happiness is you. Letting Natalie into my house that night did destroy everything. My marriage, my naivety, my belief that being good meant good things would happen. But from that destruction came something stronger, a life built on wisdom instead of wishful thinking, relationships based on mutual respect instead of codependence, a sense of self that couldn't be shaken by someone else's betrayal. Cameron found me standing in the nursery long after our daughter had fallen asleep. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, just thinking about how everything had to fall apart before it could come together. He understood without needing explanation. That's the gift of being with someone who's done their own work. They recognized the scars without needing to hear the whole story every time. We went downstairs and made tea, sat on the couch with the cat between us, his purring a constant rumble of contentment. Talked about work and plans for the weekend, and whether we should finally finish unpacking the boxes in the garage. Normal conversation, normal life, the kind of peace that's only possible after surviving chaos. Years from now, when our daughter is old enough to understand, I'll tell her about the night I let the wrong person into our house. About how that choice cascaded into disaster, about how I had to learn to trust myself again, to set boundaries, to choose carefully who gets access to my life and my home and my heart. Not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence that you can survive betrayal, that you can rebuild, that the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to define you. For now, though, I'm just grateful. Grateful for the hard lessons. Grateful for the second chances. Grateful for the people who showed up when everything fell apart. Grateful for my own resilience. Grateful that destruction sometimes clears the ground for something better to grow. The story could have ended differently. I could have stayed bitter. Could have let the betrayal poison my ability to trust anyone ever again. Could have spent my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next disaster. Some people do. I don't blame them. Trauma rewires you in ways that aren't always visible, but I chose differently. Chose therapy and hard work and brutal honesty about my own role in ignoring red flags. Chose to believe that Garrett and Natalie's choices were about them, not about my worth. Chose to try again with someone new, even though everything in me screamed that it was too risky. Those choices made all the difference. So yes, letting my husband's ex into our house that night destroyed everything, just not in the way she planned. She meant to destroy my marriage and take my place. She succeeded in the first part, but what she actually destroyed was my illusion that being nice was enough, that love conquered all, that people would treat you well just because you treated them well. She destroyed my naivety. And in doing so, she accidentally gave me the greatest gift, the chance to rebuild as someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who understood that true kindness includes being kind to yourself. And that person, she built something Natalie could never touch, could never destroy. Because it was built on truth instead of manipulation, on strength instead of weakness, on choice instead of desperation. That's the real ending. Not revenge or justice or vindication, just the quiet triumph of surviving and building something better from the ruins.